Okay. Hi, everybody. So we are here in the studio, and we're not doing doll stuff today. No, no, no. Today we're going to do sewing stuff in the studio. Can you imagine? So I had a request from a good friend of mine, shout out to Christy, that we are going to do some hand sewing. She said, I didn't see any hand sewing tutorials on your page. All I saw was regular sewing, right? Like machine sewing, I should say, not regular sewing. She said, all I saw was machine sewing. So we are going to rectify that wrong. We're going to go over some simple stitches. So here are 5 that I plan to show you. I'm going to leave this here so that we have that as a reminder. And we will go through and we will tick those off as we go. That's what our Posca pen there is for. Found this little scrap of pink fabric. So when doing hand stitching, normally you would try to find, a thread that's pretty close in color so that it disappears into your sewing. But I want you to see this, right? So I am actually going to pick out something contrasting. So I am going to use, I'm just looking at these bobbins I have here. I have this dark blue, and I think under the camera that's going to show up pretty well. I picked this bright pink because it has a lot of contrast to it, and I thought this would show off really well. Let's see what we like better. Do I like that dark blue, or do I like... I thought about using this gray because it's a... All right, I've decided that I like this upholstery thread better, I think, just because I think it's going to stand out more in general. So we'll go with this. It's this light gray color. Now I'm just going to cut a length of thread. This is something I get asked a lot. How much thread should I cut? And really, you don't want to cut so much that it's going to tangle, but you don't want to cut so little that you run out soon. So this is about somewhere between 24 and 30 inches. So I just randomly cut off about 30 inches, and then I picked a needle. Needles are kind of your own choice, really. Like, find one that you think you can thread. If you're using like a really thin, fine fabric, then you'll want a really thin, narrow needle. So these go on wire gauge. So the bigger the number, the thinner the wire, right? And the lower the number, the thicker. So if you're using something like, if you're sewing through something like denim or canvas, you'll want a pretty heavy duty needle. And if you're sewing through something like chiffon, you'll want something very thin and easy to slip through, so you're not creating big holes and snags in the fabric. So this is a fairly fine needle. This was just something I had on hand. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in on my work here. So I brought us a little bit closer in so you can see what I'm doing a little bit more cleanly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to thread the needle. And depending on what you're going to do, you're either going to want a single width of thread or you're going to want a double. I'm going to go with double right now, mostly so you can see what I'm doing. So this would be like if you're sewing 2 pieces of fabric together. And so the first thing we're going to start on is the straight stitch. So the straight stitch is you're joining 2 pieces of fabric together. This could be used for repair or for just making something. But this is just 2 pieces of fabric joining together. So I'm going to, so I've got my thread doubled over. My camera or not. So I've got my thread doubled over. I've got my 2 ends in this hand, and I'm going to tie a knot. And this is how I was shown to tie a knot. Take your 2 thread ends, you wrap your thread around, and then you roll, just kind of working them together. Now you roll them together off the end of your finger, and then you pull, and that will create quite the substantial knot that takes some getting used to. So go back, replay that slowly so you can see what I'm doing, and experiment with that until you get it down, because that can take a minute. Now, until you get used to it, and even now sometimes you'll end up with kind of some long thread ends. I will usually trim those off. So I've got my little thread nippers here, and I'm just going to trim that off pretty close to the knot so I don't have a bunch of thread hanging off the end. And so now I've got my needle and my thread, and I'm ready to go. Also now, usually I would, because I'm doing some hand sewing, and depending on the hand sewing that you're doing, I might run this through some wax. So this is just a little chunk of paraffin wax. I get this at the grocery store. It's the stuff you use for canning. So it's really cheap. It's available. You can also get beeswax if you prefer that. And I'm just going to keep my thumb on the wax, and I'm going to run my thread through the wax. What that does is it kind of lubes the thread up a little bit. It also kind of binds it together a little bit, so it's less likely to tangle up on you. So just one through of wax is plenty. You don't need to, we're not making candles. So I ran this through my wax really quick just to kind of give it a quick moment. And now I'm going to start my seam. So I've got my edges of my fabric lined up together, and I'm going to sew across. If you need to start off, it is totally okay to mark your seam allowance. The seam allowance is the difference from your seam to the edge of the fabric. That's your seam allowance. And until you get used to sewing in a straight line, it is totally okay to mark that. So I'm going to mark a 1/2 inch seam allowance. That's usually what I use. And I'm using this pencil. This is a chalk pencil, but you can use just school chalk. So you can buy something like this online, but until you know this is something you want to do, don't spend a lot of money on a lot of stuff. You can use a regular pencil if this is going to be on the inside of your material, of whatever you're making. Just use a school pencil, right? This is a cheap, I got a bunch of these from the dollar store. Just use a school pencil. It's fine. You don't buy a lot of really expensive equipment until you know this is something that you want to do. So I've loaded up my chalk. I'm got my ruler held down, and I'm just marking where I want my seam allowance, where I want my seam to be. There. Took my chalk pencil and I drew a line down where I want my seam to be to make my life easier. You can also pin this if you need to hold it in place so that your fabric doesn't shift around on you while you're sewing. All right. And now let's get to sewing. So I've got I'm right-handed, so I'm going to show this to you right-hand dominant. I apologize for that, but so I'm going to start in very close to the edge of my seam. I'm going to go out all the way through, and then I'm coming back up right on that line that I drew. And I'm going to pull through. I want to lock this first stitch in just in case. So I'm going to come back about halfway through that stitch, and then I'm going to come back about where I came through the first time. And that just kind of locks that in. And now I'm just going to do that all the way across. So I just go back and forth. I go out through both and then back in through both, and I pull. Be careful you don't pull this too tight. We're not trying to pucker it, right? We want this to lay flat. So if you accidentally pull it too tight, just flatten it out a little bit. It should flatten out pretty nicely for you. All right, so we're going to go back through, back and forth. Once you get fairly good at gauging the size, you can do a couple of seams at the same time. I mean, a couple of stitches at the same time, not a couple of seams. Boy, I can't talk today. Once you get good at it, you can kind of, see this rocking motion I'm doing with my hands, you can kind of build up several stitches before pulling through. And then flatten it out. Now, be mindful of your thread here. I can see that this knotted up a little bit on me, or it tried to. Didn't totally knot up because of the wax, but it tried to. It got a little twisted on itself. So I'm just going to pull that out with my needle just to straighten that out, and then pull it through. Sometimes you might have to go one thread at a time just to kind of tighten that up. and then straighten it out, flatten it right out. So here I'm just pulling on the fabric to flatten that back out. All right. And I'm going to keep going all the way across. And that is a straight stitch. And these stitches, they're 1/4 inch or smaller. They can really be whatever size you want them to be, but because I want this to hold my garment, I want it to be pretty strong, I want to work with fairly small stitches. That brings me to the next stitch, which is a basting stitch. A basting stitch is essentially the same as a straight stitch. So I'm going to snip my thread here and start over. So snip my knot. And I did lock this in, so I'm going to use my seam ripper to kind of pull that through. There we go. All right. In a basting stitch, I'm not going to tie a knot. You can if you need to, if you find yourself pulling your thread all the way out. I'm not going to. I'm only going to use one thread. You can use both, but I'm only going to use one. So I'm pulling my needle up a little bit on my thread so that now my thread ends are uneven. This is called the tail of the thread, and my tails are now uneven. I've got one much shorter than the other. So I really need to keep track of these two tails. For a basting stitch, this is a temporary stitch. I'm just trying to hold something together temporarily. So it's a straight stitch, but I'm not going to lock it down at the beginning. I'm not going to tie it off. And I'm going to take really big, chunky stitches. So these are a little over 1/4 inch. Maybe not quite 1/2 inch, but they can be. Sometimes they can be really big. Again, I'm just holding this together. I'm pulling this down, but I'm leaving this tail long. I'm not trying to pull it out. You see that? And so I'm just stitching really big. This is really big, really fast. This is temporary. Sometimes you want to do this if you've got like slippery fabrics that are kind of not holding together and you're worried about them moving once you get them into a sewing machine. Sometimes you baste things together just to kind of hold all your layers together so that you can go back and do like a machine stitch or some kind of fancy stitching on it. Maybe you want to do some embroidery on it and you don't want your layers to shift around. All kinds of reasons to baste things together. So it's a basting stitch. It's just a really fast, quick stitch where it's just temporary. When you're done doing whatever it is, then you just pull the stitches out. The next stitch we're going to talk about is the back stitch. Ooh, let's use our Posca pen. So we did the straight stitch. Now let's do the basting stitch. Then we did the back stitch. Now we're doing the back stitch. So what's the back stitch? So a back stitch, and I'm going to do just one length of thread again. So I've got my tails are uneven. I got one really short tail and one really long tail. I'm going to tie my knot at the end again. So I just wrap around and then I roll it down to create the knot and then snip all that extra off. I've already waxed this, so I don't need to wax it again. So a back stitch starts off just like a regular straight stitch. So we go in and we come up. Now what we do is we go about halfway between where our stitch came out and the knot, and we put our needle back through. And then we come back out a stitch length away from our thread. So on the front, this is what it looks like. On the back, this is what it looks like. All right. So again, we come back halfway into this gap and we come back out a full stitch length. So we're back stitching on ourselves. This is a stronger stitch than a straight stitch. So if you are making a seam, if you're sewing something that needs to be a little bit stronger, that is a back stitch. And again, you know, feel free to go through and slow this down if you need to, speed it up, right? Make it make sense for you. So once this is done, right, it'll look like this on the front, and it will look like that on the back. That's your back stitch. All right. Once again, I'm going to clip my thread so that we can start over. So I'm going to snip my knot. Now notice how much harder this is going to be to pull out. Remember how easy that straight stitch and the basting stitch was to pull out? This is much harder. I actually need to go in with my seam ripper and I need to pop these stitches out. And I found it's easier to pop them out from the back. Boom, just like that. Okay, so let's say I've got a garment that used to be sewn, but the seam has come undone. What do? So the seam has come undone. I'm just going to kind of finger press this so it looks like a seam that's opened up. All right, so I've got this seam, like let's say this was once sewn and it came undone. How do I stitch this up? All right, so I'm going to start with my thread again. I've got my tails are 2 different lengths. I've got one short length and one long length. At the end of the long length, I'm going to tie a knot, wrap it around my finger, and roll it down to the end. Pull it tight to create the knot, and then I snip to neaten that up at the end. Now I go into, so I've got this folded edge, and I'm going to say, you know, to here, I'm going to put these pins in to simulate this is where the seam ends. So it's stitched up to here. All right, this is all sewn. This has come undone or is not sewn yet, and I need to sew this up. What do? So I come in with my thread, and I'm going to come into and underneath this fold. All right, so I'm in and coming up underneath the fold, very close to where the end of that sewn seam is. All right, so now I flipped it back around and I've got my thread is coming up here. I'm going to pinch these two together and I'm just going to pick up little bites of fabric. So there's a little bite of fabric. Not catch my pins. So I caught a little pinch of fabric on the top, then on the bottom, and I'm making sure to only go through the edge of the fold. So this is again called a ladder stitch, an invisible stitch. I guess this isn't really a whip stitch, this is a ladder stitch. Or an invisible stitch. So we're gonna take our list back and we're gonna make our corrections. It's not a whip stitch, it's a ladder stitch. We can add whip down here. So if this isn't a whip stitch, what is a whip stitch? A whip stitch is literally just coming over both ends of whatever you're sewing, and you're just going over and over and over it. So I'm coming from the same side. I'm just nipping just a little teeny bit. So do you see the difference? This is our ladder stitch or our invisible stitch. This is our whip stitch. Am I on camera? So do you see the difference? Okay. So there's our whip stitch. We got that one done too. Now all we need is our hem stitch. What does a hem stitch look like? All right, let me cut my knot again, because I've undone and redone this many times. The end of my thread's getting kind of world weary, so I'm just going to trim that off. Okay, so now we've got something we want to hem. So a hem is usually where we have our fabric folded and then folded over a second time to create a hem. So I'm just going to pin this down. Pin our hem. And I'm again going to start with a single length of thread, so my or single thickness of thread, so my tails are asymmetrical. I've got one really short and one really long. I'm going to tie a knot at the end of the long one. Snip it close to the knot. And I'm going to start off on my hem stitch. So if I can, if I've got a raw edge like this, I'll come up through the fold like I did with my ladder stitch. If I can't, just taking a nip like this is fine. And you want to come up through the fold again. I'm going to come up through the fold as close to the edge as possible. And then I'm just going to pick up just, so this is the front of the garment. So say this is a skirt. This would be the hem of the skirt. This is the front of the garment. This is the wrong side of the garment, all right? So I'm going to pick up, so I've come through the fold in my hem. I'm going to pick up just a few threads. Can you see that? I've picked up just a few threads on my needle and pulled it through. The idea is if you're using, you know, a thread that matches your fabric, this will just about disappear. Now I'm going to take a normal sized stitch. Now sometimes this will happen when you're working with a single thread width, is that you'll pull your thread out of your eye. No problem. I'll just snip it so it's a fresh end, and I'll rethread my needle. First time I thread this needle, it went through so easily. There we go. All right, back at it. Not at all on screen. Let's see, can you see me now? So picking up just a few threads. Pick up just a few threads. And then getting into the fold of the fabric. When I get close to my pins, just pull them out so that they're not in your way. So hopefully that makes sense. And that is what your hem stitch looks like. So I'm going to pull it just a little bit so you can kind of see what those stitches look like. So this is on the inside of the garment. And then on the wrong side, even with this gray, you can barely see it. See how teeny tiny those stitches are that I'm pulling. You're just pulling up a few threads. All right, so that was our hem stitch. And that's it. So hopefully this was helpful and useful to you. If it was, give it a like, a subscribe, a share, a comment. If something didn't make sense, comment down below. If they all made sense and you were able to do this, great. Let me know down in the comments. If you'd like me to do some other kind of stitching or show you how, this is in a garment that am I working on anything right now? I don't know if I'm working on anything right now. Usually I do hand stitching now for, finishing things because I do a lot of things on my machine, but sometimes hand stitching still is the best answer. There's no one answer to a lot of this stuff. So anyway, hope that's helpful, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.